All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Darren Davidson. I'm on the planning committee for the Pollinator Summit. I work for CSU Extension. I'm the Sustainable Landscape State Specialist. It's a new position, so I have to think about it. It's so great to see everybody here in person. So happy that so many of you joined us today. I have the honor and privilege of introducing our keynote speaker, Mr. Stephen Buchmann. He's joined us today from Tucson, Arizona. He's a pollination and conservation biologist in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Department at the University of Arizona. Bear down if any of you are alums, which I am. He's published nearly 200 scientific papers and 10 books, including The Forgotten Pollinators, along with Gary Nabhan, and the recent The Reason for Flowers from Scribner. He's a frequent guest on NPR radio programs, including All Things Considered and Science Friday. And reviews of his books have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and other national media. So we're really thrilled to have him here today. If you'll all please welcome Steve Buchmann. Sorry, I forgot one thing. There will be time for questions. And what we're going to do is we have runners that have index cards. So if you have a question throughout the presentation, you can raise your hand. Somebody will bring you a card and you can fill that out, hand it back. And then at the end, we'll go ahead and ask him those questions.
Great. Thanks, Darren and Adrian. So I have to say, good morning, pollinators! Or at least pollinator observers. You know, be thankful that we're not in some place in China where we're climbing up in a tree having to hand pollinate fruit trees, right? Because that kind of thing is happening when things go wrong with insecticides and pollinators. So, let's see. That is one of my all-time favorite bees from Arizona. I love to work on it. It is Centris caesalpinii. I've only found it nesting twice. It is visiting a Cremaria, a ratany, and this usually happens in the tropics, but in the southwestern deserts it happens as well. So instead of producing nectar for pollinators, this plant, this Cremaria, is producing floral oils. Really sexy, chemically bizarre, if there are any chemists in the crowd, beta-acetoxy substituted free fatty acids. But the bees carry these back to their nest and mix them with pollen. So that is the brood food for these particular tropical bees that have migrated north into our deserts. And throughout my career, I've tried to balance my basic research, which is my first love is buzz pollination, but also these oil collecting bees. I've spent many years working with John Alcock at Arizona State University on the alternative male mating strategies of bees. Bees do some pretty kinky things out there in the desert to find mates. And I've published a few books on pollinator conservation and trying to do a lot of public outreach. So I was on the National Academy of Sciences panel with May Barenbaum was our fearless leader. And it's been a while now, but this is still available actually online for free as a PDF from the National Academy's website, and that's the status of pollinators in North America. Quite a bit of the data is still valid. I had a lot of fun with my first book, with my wild pollinator, Gary Nabhan, so we wrote The Forgotten Pollinators, which was kind of a call to arms about things we were seeing around the world with vanishing pollinators, and this was published by Island Press. Sadly, things have only gotten worse. I was for several years a counselor with the Xerxes Society in Oregon, and we produced this pollinator conservation handbook, which has now been updated, and I was also involved with writing this African Pollinators Initiative. A couple years ago, I produced The Reason for Flowers, which is kind of a fun book looking at how flowers have influenced human culture through time and space, everything from flowers that were discovered, preserved, dried in King Tut's tomb to what you can do with your local, growing your own flowers and things to remember, like not planting a lot of hybrid flowers for pollinators because They show up and go, hey, where's the nectar? Where's the pollen? Did this other older book with the Linnaean Society on the conservation of bees. And if you'd like one of these Bee Basic booklets, please send me an email and I'll send you a PDF of this. This was illustrated by not me, but by an incredible U.S. stamp artist, Steve Buchanan from Connecticut. And then the last little commercial I'll give is I have my newest book coming out in March, again published by Island Press, What a Bee Knows, Exploring the Thoughts, Memories, and Personalities of Bees. So I know I'm going to get into a little bit of trouble about this, but it's following on the heels of the book by my colleague Lars Chitka, and he produced a book in July called The Mind of a Bee, and I explore some of the similar things. Are bees self-aware? Are they sentient? Do they sleep? Do they dream? And are they smart? Can they count? And the answers to a lot of these questions are yes. Okay, so let's get into the meat of the talk here. The biodiversity and the taxonomic impediment. I first want to say that I am not a taxonomist, but I've worked with a lot of bee and botanical taxonomists, so I know what kinds of things are involved. We have a glorious planet with lots and lots of incredible animals and plants, archaea, fungi, all kinds of weird things, new phyla and things that when I was an undergraduate I didn't imagine we would have this kind of diversity. And it is literally in our hands. You know that through agriculture and urbanization and just land loss and habitat conversion, we're losing lots and lots of habitats and species. There was a really great book that was edited a number of years ago by the late great Edward Wilson of Harvard called Biodiversity, as well as lots and lots of other Wilson books. One of the questions that I think about a lot, and taxonomists and biogeographers think about a lot, and this slide should say how many described animal species are there on Earth, not the exact number that are actually out there. So since the 80s or so, we began to devise methods, some quantitative methods, some subjective methods, like taxonomists sitting around museums over coffee, you know, hey, how many beetles species are there in the world, you know? Well, I don't know. Well, Terry Irwin said there were 30 million, and he was out there fogging the rainforest in Costa Rica. You know, so everything like that. The number is still imprecisely known. The best thing I can figure out is that maybe 1.4 to 1.8 million. And recently I learned about this incredible resource, if you don't know about it, called the Catalog of Life, where you can go online and for different groups of organisms, plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, protozoa, what have you, figure out how many species there are and the status of them, synonymy, all kinds of stuff. And so that estimate from the Catalog of Life is currently a little over 1 million species. That is, again, for the described species. So the species that are actually living out there that entomologists and others and botanists on field trips haven't found yet is much greater. So we call this the taxonomic impediment. And it's basically that we have too few professional and amateur taxonomists finding and describing species and publishing them, giving them formal binomial names, just like Linnaeus did many years ago. So this is happening at a rate of only 6,000 to 8,000 per year. If we have 3 million species actually out there globally, it'll take another 100 years or more. Probably the real value is somewhere closer to 10 million organisms actually on this planet. So you can see it would take a much, much longer time. Years ago in a publication, Wilson said that it would take 25,000 lifetimes to do the work. This is a great paper, if you haven't seen it, by Nigel Stork. Was published in the Annual Review of Entomology in 2018. And so his best estimate by going through the literature and talking to taxonomists is that there are 5.5 million species of insects, of which 1.5 million are beetles. But, as I said, obviously many plant and animal species will go extinct before they're even discovered or formally named or cataloged, and this is really, really sad. Well, let's look at some diversity. We've got some really sexy pollinators out there. Hummingbirds from Arizona. We have more than Colorado, but Colorado has 4. Sorry, hummingbird snob. I'm not a birder, but I do love, we have a little hummingbird garden in our backyard and a butterfly garden, so we like to watch them come in and watch the males fight. In the southern hemisphere, you have other nectar-loving birds like the white eyes. There's even a large pollinator, which pollinates the traveler's palm in Madagascar, believe it or not, and that's the ruffed lemur. One of my buddies, Mark Moffat, who's a member of the New York Explorers Club and has written books and is really a crazy, crazy guy who does a lot of outreach, and he's known as Dr. Bugs. He's a freelance National Geographic photographer, and I think he holds the record for the most number of insect photos, well, people photos too, but insect photos in Nat Geo. I think he's up to 500 of his photos have been published in Nat Geo. He took a trip to Mauritius, and this is one of his photos of the blue day gecko, which actually pollinates some rare plants there that have blue nectar. Really, really strange things. There are also some lizard pollinators on offshore islands off New Zealand that pollinate wild flax. So even some lizards get in on the act. From my home state, I like to look at in Arizona and Sonora, the Leptonicterus yerba bueni, the Sanborn's long-nosed bat, which was formerly on the endangered species list, but it's now been removed. It's been recovered. These long-nosed, dog-faced bats pollinate agave, the century plants. They also pollinate columnar cacti as well. A month ago, I was standing in the gorgeous Kirstenbosch Botanical Gardens at the base of Table Mountain in South Africa, and I was photographing, much to the chagrin of my guide, just like rapid fire, boom, 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 with my big lens, all the sunbirds that were coming in, but they were just magnificent, and I really had not seen them much in the wild. In South Africa and also in Australia, we have little mice, little rodents. Here's a honey possum, actually a marsupial, pollinating Banksia. So this sorts of thing happens also. Well, let's get to the invertebrates. Some of my favorites. Here's a white-lined sphinx moth, Hyles lineata. We also have in the Sonoran Desert many manduca and many, many other hawk moth species. There's a Danaid, a monarch relative up there. Thrips, which can damage flowers and eat pollen, but they can also be pollinators. Turns out that they are some of the very ancient pollinators. There's a long-nosed nemestrinid fly, much like a bombolid or bee fly. Again, from South Africa, something I saw down in the lower left. Monkey beetles, which pollinate a lot of like Gerbera African daisies and also the Mesembryanthemum, ice plant things. You have ants there, which can be pollinators, even though they're not very hairy, but sometimes they can be anti-pollinators. One of my first entrees into the rainforests of Costa Rica, there's a male orchid bee, the genus Euglossa, and they're really living jewels. And they do visit orchids and pick up the shrink-wrapped pollen known as Pollinia. Down in the far right is a wasp family, Maceridae, that you have here, the genus Pseudomaceros. They often visit Phacelia, and it's one of the only wasp families that, much like a bee, the females go out and collect nectar and pollen, bring that back to a nest, make a little pollen ball, and lay an egg on it. So they're very bee-like in their life history. And there's even some weirder things out there. Holy cow, crabs, polychaetes. I never would have believed this, but some people recently have put cameras, submarine cameras, near seagrasses, and they're seeing all kinds of weird marine things coming in and collecting the pollen. So this was really strange. Back when I was a grad student in Southern California at Cal State Fullerton, my botany professors told me that the most ancient flowers in the world were giants. You know, they were things like tulip tree, liriodendron, and magnolia. And so I believed that for decades. But it's wrong. There are clay pits near Kincora, New Jersey, and other places where fires went through these ancient forests and actually charcoalized, I don't know what the word is, but anyway, made charcoal imprints, perfect 3D fossils of these ancient flowers. And they're all small. They're all like 1 to 2 millimeters across. So the first flowering plants, the angiosperms, 140 or so million years ago, were tiny. They weren't giants. And they were pollinated generally by small things, although I'll show you in a bit there were some larger pollinators as well. And here are some of those ancient pollinators. Actually, these are a little bigger. There's some thrips up there that were stuck in resin, and then an artist reconstruction of where the pollen was. On the top, we also have some long-beaked scorpion flies. These are pretty rare. Sometimes in eastern forests, you'll see them called hanging flies. On Colorado snowfields, sometimes you find boreads, which are snow scorpion flies. But then a fellow at the Smithsonian in D.C. has been looking at these incredible large peacock lacewings, which are lacewing relatives that have eye spots like some butterflies. So that's pretty cool. And so pollinating these ancient angiosperms, and as they change through time, were these old pollinators. And we have to include beetles and flies because they were there and they were very, very important. So let's look at some global insect diversity. This is some of that GBIF, or actually in this case, I think it's Catalog of Life stuff. Beetles, almost 400,000 species. Butterflies and moths, Lepidoptera, over 150,000. Similar for Diptera. My favorite group, the Hymenoptera, over 100,000. So if you tally all of these things up, I think in the Forgotten Pollinators book, Gary and I proposed that there might have been 200,000 pollinators. Well, we were a little off, so we now think there are about 350,000 insect pollinators pollinating the world's 360, 370,000 species of angiosperms. Those numbers, if you're a botanist, are all over the map too. As you can imagine, that's really difficult to figure out. One thing, as I was putting the talk together, I was like, wow, look at that. There are probably 140,000 moth species that have long mouth parts that are obviously needing to go after nectar from flowers. So, hey, maybe we shouldn't be talking about the measly 21,000 species of bees. We've got 140,000 moths out there. But in all seriousness, bees and certain wasps are champion pollinators because they're not just collecting pollen for themselves, but primarily to feed the brood. And that's generally below ground or in a cavity nest. I know this is a little hard to see, but I just wanted to show you the most recent phylogenetic diagram we have for bees. This is work out of my colleague Brian Danforth's lab at Cornell University. So we have really good evidence that the bees first evolved around 130 million years ago, and then they branched off, and eventually into the Cenozoic, we have some modern bee faunas. And we have these 7 families that you probably know about. There's the Apidae that has honeybees and bumblebees. There's the megachilid family, which has osmia bees and leafcutter bees. We have some strange families that you probably haven't heard of, like Melitidae, which is also an oil-collecting bee family. And then if you're lucky enough to go to Australia, we have Stenotridids. And even though Darwin talked about his abominable mystery for the origin of angiosperms, we have a small but growing record of bee fossils. So Brian Danforth and George Poinar a few years ago published Miletus fix burmensis, which they found in amber from Burma, Myanmar, and it's about 100 million years old. And it has some features that all bees have, like branched hairs. But looking at it more and more, they're now thinking that, well, this is a proto-bee, really. It's a wasp ancestor. So the first true bee that we have from the fossil record is this Cretotrigona prissa, and it's not quite as old. It's about 70 million years old, also from amber. The problem with this one, it is that it is a worker stingless bee, and so it's a fairly highly evolved bee, and that's our first bee. So we obviously know that there were solitary progenitors before this. So in truth, we haven't found the world's oldest bee yet in the fossil record. Well, how did bees, go from having their ancestors as these meat-eating monsters that show up at our picnic and go after our ham sandwiches, yellow jackets? So all of the bees evolved from wasp ancestors. So they were evolving from meat-eating carnivorous ancestors. And we all know bees as these gentle little plant-loving vegans, right? They would never hurt anything. Well, it turns out that there are some hunting wasps in the family Carbonidae, in the Ammoplannina group, and these evolved in the Cretaceous. And in the top right is a photo of a thrips in amber with some pollen grains on its body. And then on your left is a high-resolution micro CT scan. I make sure every once in a while that I'm talking about the right slide. Yeah. So we have a CT scan with some enhancement showing the pollen grains. And then in the bottom we have a modern ammoplannine wasp, and there are about 130 living species today. So now what we think has happened with bees is that the bee ancestors were these thrip-hunting wasps, and they were getting their protein from the thrips, but the thrips were covered in pollen. And so we think that the bees gradually shifted away and said, hey, pollen's pretty tasty. And that's the story I have for you. Oh, I should mention, I don't have it in here, but I can't resist saying that depending where you are in the country or the world, about 10 to 20% of your local bees may be stealthy bees that are cuckoo bees. They're not crazy, but they are kleptoparasites, so they don't make an honest living. So those females will stay lurking around, and they'll wait for a female host bee to leave its nest, and then the kleptoparasite, the cuckoo bee, will sneak in, lay an egg, and so it's just like cowbird, the strategy of cowbirds sneaking eggs into bird nests. So the foster parents raised the wrong kids. And along with some other recent things that you probably haven't heard about is that we're finding out that bees are microbial farmers, or at least brewmasters. We have a big NSF group from Cornell and several UC Davis schools, as well as the University of Arizona. And what we do is we're going around the world sampling different bees, extracting the pollen, extracting the DNA, purifying it, doing PCR amplification of the DNA, and then doing amplicon and shotgun metagenomics. So we're trying to figure out the genomes of everything that's in there. So trying to identify all of the helpful, harmful bacteria, archaea, yeasts in there. And some of these things are quite interesting. You break them open and you think you're in a brewery, and the very watery provisions are bubbling, and that's CO2 because there's active fermentation going on from bacteria and yeasts. So the most surprising thing we found is that we think that in many of these cases, these bee larvae are getting as much protein, as much nutrition from eating the microbial meat as they are from the pollen. Okay, bee diversity, lots and lots of bees out there. 20,759 described species, 529 genera in 7 families. In the United States, I usually say around 4,000 species, but it's actually 3,594. California has the most, unfortunately. I used to say Arizona had the most, but California has lots and lots of diverse habitats. So California 1,500, Arizona 1,000, of which half are specialists, and Colorado, hey, 938. A former student and now Professor Joseph Wilson does this really wonderful, I do a lot of insect macrophotography too, but Joe really pioneered this technique of bees on white backgrounds, right? And so he creates these really, really special things. And he, with another co-author, wrote this wonderful book called Bees in Your Backyard, which is profusely illustrated. And if you haven't seen it and you love bees, you really need that book in your library. You saw one of these earlier in Adrian's, the headshot of the osmia. There's another osmia. There's an anthidiine bee in the middle. Bees that can make nests out of plant fibers or resins and little pebbles. You can see a very small perdita there. In fact, the world's smallest bee comes from the southwestern deserts, Perdita minima. It's only 2 millimeters long. And my favorite thing that I've worked on is buzz pollination. And here literally is where female bees will turn themselves into living tuning forks. So if you think of these flowers as like a salt shaker, and the salt grains are the pollen grains inside, the female bees must bite the anther, and then they shiver their flight muscles, and this energizes the pollen, and within just a few tenths of a second, blasts out all of the tens or hundreds of thousands of pollen grains within the flower. So we did some tests a few years ago showing that bumblebees were 400 times faster at collecting pollen using buzzing or floral sonication than were honeybees. Honeybees, for whatever reason, we don't know, we're still trying to figure it out, but several kinds of bees do not ever use buzz pollination, and honeybees don't. So when you put honeybees on blueberries or cranberries and expect them to buzz pollinate the crop, well, it's kind of a false sense of security. You see a lot of bees flying out of the hives, but they're not doing the right kind of pollination. So I've studied the botanical aspects of this too, and here are anthers from all kinds of different flowers around the world. Manzanita and solanum, just weird tropical things. Pedicularis, so some flowers, the elephant head, will become pored or functionally pored due to the flower, not just the anthers. Let's see if my little animation works here. Yay! Some people call this a noxious weed. How dare they? This is a roadside weed, but it is Solanum elaeagnifolium, and it's one of my favorite plants in Arizona. It's prickly and horrible, but it has those little pores and attracts the right bees to sonicate it. Now I'm going to show you what my colleague Dan Papage and some of our students do. So we take that bumblebee, Bombus impatiens, that we can buy. That's the eastern bumblebee. We don't let them free fly. They're only in the lab. They do their thing in the lab, and then at the end of 3 or 4 months, we euthanize the colonies so they can't fly outside and spread into the wild. They have in some places in Arizona and other states where they are legally imported. I tried to block their importation into Arizona, but I was unsuccessful. So tomato greenhouses are leaky, and these bees can get out, and they can actually transfer pathogens to native bees, not just bumblebees, but other bees as well. Okay, let's see if this works. See that every time the female bites, she's buzzing, and that's forcing pollen out. And they come with little numbers on their backs. I don't know how that happened. Good job. Collect it and then room it onto those predictable. I also like to do things with 3D scanning and photogrammetry and micro CT scans, and working with an artist right now in Tucson, Bill Singleton, who's incredible with 3D, and he created this 3D diagram. Actually, everything in this picture, which is 2D, is actually created as a 3D model, and you can spin it around and look at it. But I just want to use it as a reminder to tell you that bees and other pollinators don't just pollinate. They do some other cool things, right? People don't think about it, but bees and their larvae are also food for other animals. Birds, lizards, mice, birds, okay? There's also something called bioturbation. Think of earthworms. Think of Darwin's earthworms. Darwin wrote a whole book on earthworms and had his famous worm stone and did all that cool stuff. Bees do the same thing. They're tunneling to make their nests, to hide away their brood cells, and they're aerating the soil. And when all that yummy pollen is defecated out by those larvae, that stays in the ground, and so it fertilizes the ground. Also, adult bees will fly and defecate in flight, and the pollen and nitrogen and phosphorus-rich pollen fertilizes. You may know about the giant Asian honeybees, which go on mass mating, but also defecation flights in the Asian tropics. And this was a weird thing years ago, a controversial thing that people thought this was chemical warfare in villages in Asia, but it was actually just the yellow rain was bee poop on leaves. So yeah, I'll finish this slide by saying the fertilization, they cycle nutrients, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So super, super important in ecosystems all over. Of course, we owe a lot of pollination to different bees. My friend Dave Rubik published a nice book where he cataloged 1,440 worldwide crops pollinated by bees and other animals. In the United States, we probably have around 100 or so major crops that require pollination, except, of course, wind pollination in cereals and grasses and some nut crops where bees are not involved. But getting into the causes of pollinator declines, some of them are pretty obvious. You know, you scrape away paradise and put up a parking lot. Land changes, habitat changes, environmental pollution in the form of air pollution, plastics, herbicides, insecticides, everything. Climate change. We're obviously living in a warmer world. Springs are coming earlier to a lot of places. A lot of animals are being sort of forced off the top of mountains, and they have nowhere else to go. This next slide is super busy, but I like to use it. I like to think of this as pollinator threats, death by 1,000 cuts, right? So we have disruption, fire, storms, global warming, nitrification, droughts, pollution, invasive species, deforestation, insecticides, and two that I like to think about that don't get talked about much at all are the lights at night, you know, horrible security lights, lights at gas stations. These attract billions of insects, including a lot of moths and other pollinators. And traffic, you know, hey, what's that gunk on your windshield? That gunk is pollinators in a lot of cases. So we're now trying to figure out what some of the estimated biomass mortality due to traffic. But I'm thinking that traffic may eventually be number one or number two, because you think of millions and millions of cars and trucks literally filter feeding on every roadway and interstate, and the loss of pollinators is just abysmal. Just put up a few titles from some papers, declines, things you see in newspapers as well. These are scientific papers. So there are some estimates around the world. Here are some global ones. A 2017 German study with many sites found biomass of flying insects had declined by 75% in the previous quarter century. Another study, more recently, 2021, analyzing GBIF data over a century. Bee species had declined steeply after the 1990s and shrunk by a quarter in 2006 to 2015. And sadly, 1/3 of the wild bee and hoverfly, the syrphid fly species, are in decline, as evidenced by monitoring programs in Great Britain. What about the U.S.? Could give dozens of these, but here are a few. We've got 49 species of bumblebees in the U.S., and 25% are in drastic decline. Butterflies, through iNaturalist and other things, we now see that there are almost 2% annually losses of common western butterflies. And of course, for the beekeepers in the crowd, you know that due to winter loss and colony collapse disorder, depending on what part of the country you live in, and the fact that we now have a lot fewer colonies than we did. Back in the 40s, we had about 6 million. Now we're down to about 2.5 million. I will say that beekeepers are super resilient and clever, and unlike some of these other bees, with honeybees, you can do something that's very simple that's called making a colony divide. So you can actually pretty simply and rapidly turn one colony back into two. So even though we hear about these horrible things with honeybees, with insecticides and varroa and tracheal mites and small hive beetles and chalk brood and foul brood, they're hit by a lot of problems. But fortunately, beekeepers know about this stuff, and they can, with given enough resources and support, manage and increase their colonies. In Hawaii, we have small native bees, the genus Hyleus, and 8 of 60 of these species are believed extinct. Okay, so the bumblebee picture, you've probably heard about this. The most threatened one that is usually in the news is the rusty-patched bumblebee, Bombus affinis, and also the American bumblebee, Bombus pennsylvanicus. In California, when I was a grad student in the late 70s, Bombus occidentalis was everywhere. Now when I go back for visits, I can't find it anywhere. And these were probably due to what has been termed pathogen spillover due to these protozoans, Crithidia and Nosema bombus. So these are parasites, parasitic microbial organisms, disease organisms that escaped from managed bumblebee colonies that originally came from Europe. So sadly, we have about 1/4 of North American bumblebees that face some degree of risk. We probably have the first extinction of a bumblebee anywhere in the world, and that's Bombus franklini, which occupied a very small habitat, 300 by 100 kilometers up in southern Oregon and California in the Cascades. My PhD advisor, the late Robin Thorpe, monitored this quite extensively, and Robin last saw this bee in 2006, and teams from the Pollinator Partnership in San Francisco and the Xerces Society in Oregon have gone out looking for them every spring and summer, and they go to the places where they used to be most abundant, and again, no, they're not there. So they may be hiding, they may be still out there, but we think they're probably extinct. This was the first bee listed as an endangered bee back in 21. So obviously, as you guys talk about here at the conference, there is a need for enhanced pollinator monitoring. One of my partners in crime is Sam Droege of the U.S. Geological Survey, and Sam was really involved in frog monitoring and then is now the super guru of bee monitoring. He has published, and you can find it online, his standard 1 hectare bee plot. And so it's a combination of using pan traps, little soapy bowls filled with soapy water. Sadly, no lifeguard on duty. It looks like a flower. The bees fly in. Now they're a specimen. So check out some of Sam Droge's. There are lots of citizen science things happening, and Adrian gave a really nice view of what's happening with iNaturalist and things at his own university and museum, so I'm not going to go through those. Many, many research scientists and grad students and postdocs are looking at this. I will call out some really cool NGOs, the Xerces Society, also the Pollinator Partnership in San Francisco, which is the parent organization of the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign. If you don't know about those guys, you should. It's a consortium of 140 different organizations. And then there are also things like my pal Chip Taylor and his Monarch Watch. So getting into a little of the political scheme to end up here. The Obama administration did promote a national strategy for honeybees and other pollinators. He was under a lot of pressure to do this, especially with lobbies trying to lobby against neonicotinoids and other pesticides. Sadly, in 2022, the EPA is still posed to approve 4 neonic insecticides for use on U.S. farmlands, despite having been banned in Europe for over a decade. So I think this is a big, big mistake. That administration had 3 separate 5 to 10 year goals for pollinator protection. They also had a pollinator health task force and a conservation reserve program. This was their pollinator habitat initiative. Well, way back ages ago, 26 years ago, Gary Nabhan and I started the Forgotten Pollinators campaign at the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum in Tucson. We also had another campaign called the Migratory Pollinator Campaign, which talked about 4 migratory pollinators, a hummingbird, a bat, and the monarch butterfly. You can see them on the cover of that. So we published 1 book on that. Gary and I were involved with help starting the International Pollinators Initiative, working very closely with the Brazilian government. This was pre-Bolsonaro. This was a more enlightened Brazilian government. And we came up with the Sao Paulo Declaration on Pollinators. And so there have been a number of international pollinator campaigns that have sprung forth out of this original stuff back in '96. And I'm really glad to see that they've grown. North American Pollinator Protection Campaign, NAPSI, has an annual meeting in Washington, D.C. I would say please get involved with them, or at least go to their website and find out something about them. The North American Pollinator Initiative, the European Pollinator Initiative, the African, and Bring Back the Pollinators campaign from Xerxes. So these are just a few of the major ones. So threats to pollinators are diverse and can interact. The current challenge is to better quantify the relative importance of a range of drivers, ecological drivers, and in particular their synergistic effects, because they are synergistic. But given the weight of evidence of pollinator loss and associated risk, the investment in developing mitigation options such as agri-environment schemes and protected area networks, alternative managed pollinators, bringing them in to have a balanced pollinator portfolio, if you will, is essential to ensure sustainable services in a changing, warming, scarier world. So with that, I think I will stop and see if we have any questions.
How about a big round of applause? Our current, fleet of cars are mostly combustion engines, which are the filter feeders. So you have a radiator which sucks air in. Do you think electric cars will have any impact potentially on, decreasing, how many bugs we kill with our cars?
Yeah, somebody needs to. I've flown jojoba flowers and things in wind tunnels to study the biophysics of aerodynamics, but I haven't flown any car models in wind tunnels. But somebody should. But I think that even Teslas, as sexy as they are, I think they'll be killing a good share of pollinators. And look at semi trucks, and or motorhomes that have this blunt, flat face. I mean, those are real filter feeders.
What about the timing? So, it just so happens our rush hour is also rush hour for bees, right?
Yeah, that's true. And we don't know how high different insects fly. I want to do an experiment sometime with my students where we put up sort of plexiglass banners with Stickum Special on it and quantify actually what heights different pollinators fly. Oh, wow. Maybe you can read them to me because I left my reading glasses back in the...
Sure. Well, so here's our first question. What are your thoughts on creating urban pollinator pathways? Do you know of research in this area? So pathways connecting habitat?
Yeah, I mean, it's happening a little bit. It's happening on a local basis. There's a little bit happening in Tucson, and I know of it in a few other areas, but we need to do more of that. There's a lot more, I think, that wildlife managers have done and thought about with, rewilding and for big megafauna, trying to connect them. But connecting corridors for pollinators is just as important. That a lot of hummingbirds fly long distances. For example, in Arizona, we have the rufous hummingbird, and it's one of the longest distance migrants. We have butterflies that go long ways. I mean, the monarch butterflies here, Danaid butterflies in the same group in Africa. So, yeah, we need those connecting corridors.
Here's one specific to your expertise. Is there anywhere we can find a list of genera or plant species that require buzz pollination? Broad categorizations?
Yeah, if somebody emails me about that, I'd be happy to send you a list. We're just finishing a huge paper that's taken several years, and it's been tentatively accepted by new phytologists. And this is work with Mario Vallejo Marin, who's just moved from Stirling University in Scotland to Uppsala University in Sweden, and a former PhD student of mine, Avery Russell. We now have completed a phylogenetic analysis of all the angiosperms with the latest molecular database to find out how many species have pores, slits, or valves and are buzz pollinated. So if somebody emails me, I can give you a list of the families and genera that are, I mean, the major take-home ones that are easy to remember are the genus Solanum, the deadly nightshades, Cassia and Senna in the Fabaceae. In the tropics, the Melastomataceae. Those are the main ones. There's some minor families, but those are the main ones.
Excellent. So here's someone that says, first of all, thank you for an excellent presentation. But here's a question I hear a lot. What's the ecological advantage of those kleptoparasitic bees?
The evil, lurking, kleptoparasitic bees. They even look sinister. They're usually black, and they kind of look like Darth Vader. Hey, it's an alternate form of living. They're maybe not in our estimation. Maybe they're not making an honest living, like a good, hard-working female bee, But they're really cool. One of my friends, dearest friends, who retired from the American Museum of Natural History in New York, Jerome Rosen, as a senior curator, he waited to the ripe old age of 90 to retire, and he's 94 right now, and he's still going. He made it his life's work to study these bees and dig them up. And the larvae of these bees he called hospicidal. And so they have these giant ice tongue mandibles, and they wander around inside the brood cells trying to find the egg or the larva of the host bee. And their first mission on Earth is to kill that host and then eat up all the free goodies.
One thing I would add to that is that we know a lot about the role of predators for like bird populations or ungulate populations. In insects, parasitoids and parasites play those same roles in structuring how big populations get or keeping any one species from becoming too dominant. So parasitic species are actually really important within the bee communities. Sorry to jump in there. Here's a cool question from Naomi, our visiting biology class in the back up there. What about light pollution impacts the bee population, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, if you run black lights at a nature center or something, you'll often see Hymenoptera there, but you usually see things like ichneummonid and braconid wasps. But if you do it in the morning in desert areas, there are many of our bees that are matinal or crepuscular. So some of the buzz pollinating bees that I work on are bad because I'm not a morning person, and I need at least 2 or 3 cups of coffee in about an hour to come alive in the morning. So these bees are up before sunrise or at sunrise. And you'll sometimes find those, like the genus Tiloglossa, at blacklights around sunrise. So blacklights and other lights can pull bees away. Work that people have done, in Panama on Barro Colorado Island has shown that there are nocturnal bees, true nocturnal bees, that fly by moonlight, the genus Megalopta, and those are attracted to lights. In the American Southwest, where we have a lot of Africanized bees, for whatever reason, Africanized honeybees tend to go to lights at night. Not sure why, but they do. So again, but that's a much more minor problem than all of the butterflies and beetles and everything else that goes to a store window night light or a black light, and then guess what happens in the morning? The birds are there and they scarf everything up. So typically when an insect lands at one of these lights, they, for whatever reason, they don't move on. They just stay there. They're stuck. And so they basically die.
I've got several questions about insecticides, as you may have guessed. I'm going to try to merge 3 or 4 questions into one. One, can bees move insecticides around their environment? If they're foraging on plants, can they bring them back or move them around to other flowers? And given that Europe knows so much and that they've done so much work to limit them, why is it still such a problem here in the U.S.?
Money and lobbying for the last question. For the first one, yeah, I like to think of honeybees living in their little white condos, or if they're in a bee tree or a rock cavity. Think of all the wax that's in there. It's like a sick building syndrome. So if bees are not killed outright in the field, they often get sublethal doses of these pesticides. And there are literally dozens or sometimes hundreds of them. And colleagues of mine have taken samples of brood frames, right, the old dark wax that's recycled because it's expensive. It takes 20 pounds of honey to make 1 pound of wax. They reuse it over and over again. But as the brood cycles go, every 21 days, the larvae will defecate, they spin a cocoon, next generation comes in, so you have layers of like stratification of larval bee poop and silk cocoons, and this brood wax, brood frame wax thickens. If you analyze that, you'll find dozens of nasty compounds that through the whole life of that, for months or years, they outgas, and it creates neurological and other problems for the bees. Often the bees fly out and they get confused and they can't find their way back to the nest, so they die out in the field. So that is one of the biggest, most pervasive or pernicious problems that I see, that if the bees are not killed directly by a spray or too much insecticide on the flowers, they can be killed slowly when they get back home.
And I'll do one more question and then we'll take a little break. But feel free and come up and chat with us afterwards in between. Given that you probably do a lot of work on public lands in the Southwest, when it comes to the management on public lands, is it better to leave noxious weeds like thistles or other invasive flower species on which native pollinators are foraging, or to remove them in hopes that we can regrow our natives? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I have colleagues, especially Jim Kane, who's just retired from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Logan Bee Lab in Utah. And he was working on a lot of seed mixes and working with land managers for doing revegetation. I've done some work on some of the Turner Enterprises properties, ranches that Ted Turner owns, like the Avalon Plantation near Tallahassee in Florida, and then the his small 100,000 acre place, I guess, in Montana near Bozeman, the Flying D Ranch. So ranchers like Turner have used spot applications of herbicides to get rid of things like knapweed and others. And I do think it's a good idea. I'm a little torn in some situations where there's absolute nuking of weeds, because the weeds, in giant quotes, are flowering plants that are also creating habitat in terms of broken twigs for stem nesting bees, but more than that, pollen and nectar food. They're weeds, they're growing in a place where we don't like them, we're spreading, they're spreading, but they can also be useful to bees. I spent time many years ago working in Australia for the Australian government's weed unit, and we were using entomological radar to see where honeybees were flying. And they have a plant that the beekeepers call Salvation Jane, because it produces this brilliant purple pollen and makes a great honey. And so the Aussie beekeepers were making great honey crops off of Salvation Jane, where the graziers, the sheep farmers, and people who had horse livestock hated it because they called it Patterson's curse. Mrs. Patterson had brought this plant, Echium, can't remember the species. Anyway, it's Echium something or other, and it escaped from her garden, and now it's over, another Australian story of the bug or plant that went wild and ate Australia. So that's just one example of the opposing groups where, one person's curse is another person's food plant.
Awesome. Well, I want to lead us all in a one last big thank you for Stephen for this excellent talk. We're going to take a short break now, and we'll see y'all in 5 to 7 minutes or so. We'll start our first panel, so feel free and take a break.